look in those 18 days, the majority of the people are chanting for a civil state, the separation of religion and state, which is really the base of any democracy in the world.
Dr. Azam Tamimi joining us from Amman, Jordan. I mean, are people like you actually on the sidelines? This is a secular, largely secular movement, and people, as we just heard from Cairo, want democracy and they don't want Islamic states.
Well, I think the categorizations here are a bit confusing, because it is, when you're talking, it's as if you're putting democracy versus Islam or opposed to Islam. This is nothing to do with secularism. This is not about ideology, whether this ideology is secularist or religious. This is about a popular sentiment. These are peoples who have endured despotism for many decades, and they want to be free. Now, what they decide to do with themselves afterwards is their own business.
But what do you think they should decide? What would you like to see?
Well, if I were in an Arab country that is a democracy, I would definitely join a political party that identifies with my wishes. And my wishes is to see Islam have a greater say in the lives of people. But of course, eventually it is the choice of the people. If the people don't elect my party, that's their choice, and I have to respect it.
What do you think of that? I mean, do you want to hear let 100 flowers bloom, and you just want to see what people will decide, as Dr. Tamimi suggests?
I think for a long time we have been distrusted. And we have been distrusted as a people, and therefore given these incredibly, violent men who ruled over us and have been propped up and supported by many countries for so many different reasons. And now is a time when we need to be trusted. And yes, we might choose left or right, but we need to have that opportunity.
And you need to
be given it. Yes.
Chris Maher, I suspect at the Foreign Office there's a lot of people scratching their heads and saying, what do we do about this? I mean, because they haven't got a clue, really, because none of us know.
You're absolutely right. I think they're flying almost completely blind. I don't blame them for flying almost completely blind. The crystal ball is very, very murky. They were caught on the hop when this thing started in Tunisia. They didn't know how to respond to what was going on in Egypt because it twisted and turned in the initial days. And I think you're right in saying is that the outcome in each of these countries, and maybe others that may get the contagion, if I can put it like that, is going to be likely to be very diverse. So what does the United Kingdom, what do Western governments do in these circumstances? I think above all, we must stand for hope. We must try to be on the right side of history, and we must stand for democracy and those freedoms. But if I can just complete the point, we have also to have some humility in this, and to recognize that outside powers are not going to be the mainspring of change in these countries. What is changing has got to come up from your society and other societies, and we must respect that.
Daniel Pletka, do you agree broadly with that? And do you also think that some of us, the United States, Britain, France, should recognise that we have done our best sometimes to prop up some pretty unsavoury characters in the Arab world, and it's perhaps time not to do that?
Absolutely. I mean, we have to recognize that those who are suggesting that we need to stand by as observers need to also recognize that for the last 50 or 60 years, we, the United States, the Europeans, the UK in particular, have actually been the mainspring of support for governments like that of Hosni Mubarak, even after the resolution of Pan Am 103 for Muammar Gaddafi, certainly for many of the governments in the Gulf, and that we do bear a share of responsibility for failing to use our relationships to actually begin to open the door to a process of evolution, political evolution, that might have precluded this sort of revolution that's left everybody in the Foreign Office, the State Department, the CIA and elsewhere all gobsmacked about the fact that people actually want to lead decent lives.
Do you, I don't know if you heard Sippy Livni earlier in our programme, but from her point of view, it depends what happens next. I mean, that presumably is the view in the United States too.
Well, of course. I mean, but that's all good and nice to say. The truth is that while this is in the hands of the people whose lives are most directly affected, we can't pretend that we don't have interests. We do have interests, and it's the obligation of every democratically elected leader to actually protect the interests of his country, his countrymen, his allies, and his people. The truth is we've done a rotten job of protecting those interests by standing by dictators who have been uninterested in the welfare of their people. So, yes, absolutely. absolutely. It's something we need to watch very, very carefully and recognize that had we done better in the past, we may have actually had a greater say in the future.
Gigi Ibrahim, you're nodding your head at much of that, but I just wonder, do you sometimes think why you and people older than you put up with dictators for so long? Why you didn't do this before?
Actually, it did start a long time ago. You know, with oppression and 30 years or more of lack of democracy and corruption, you have 30 years or more of resistance. And it has been accumulating. And if you really look at the history of when people started going to the streets, it really started with the Second Palestinian Intifada in 2000, and then, you know, with the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, we had mass mobilization, and then with the birth of Kifaya movement in 2004, and it just snowballed from there all the way up until last year. So the sentiment was originally that had closely to do with how the Western world, and especially the U.S. and the European countries, have you know, befriended dictators like Mubarak, who was also supporting the Iraq war unpublicly, but definitely was in support of it. And the people were really against that, and the accumulation of that mobilization, it bursted after the Tunisia example, that the power of the people could actually change the future, and the people demanded to take that charge in their own hand and to make their destiny and take charge of their governments.
Dr. Tamimi, I mean, we've heard every Western diplomat, Western voice I've talked to says we must keep out of this, we must let these events unfold. But with oil at $120 a barrel and vital strategic interests of the West, do you think the West can keep its noses out of this?
Well, I'm not sure that what they're saying in public conforms with what they do behind the scene. They're probably trying to do things that they believe are in their best interest. But I agree with one of your guests that said that so far a rotten job has been done in an attempt to serve the interests of the Western peoples, sometimes even the people of the Orient. I think policymakers in the West must get used to a new era. This is the era where the peoples of the Arab world are going to be responsible for their own affairs. And if they want to stabilize the world, it has to be stabilized according to the new rules and not the old rules.
Okay.
The people want to decide for ourselves.
Right. Let me just bring Christopher Mayer now. Do you agree with that?
Not entirely. I think what we have to accept is, first of all, it couldn't have been the United States or the United Kingdom who gave the first push to get Mubarak to resign. It had to come from the Egyptian people themselves. That's where the critical mass lay, that's where it came from, and we have to conform to that. What we may end up with, whether it's 1848, 1968 or 1989, is an extraordinarily diverse patchwork quilt of Arab nations who emerged from this process, all having responded in different ways. And we, the United Kingdom, you, the United States of America, are going to have to get on with these people, from despots to democrats, whatever the makeup of their governments are. We have to take the world as we find it, not as we like it to be.
Just a final thought before we move on, Hisham. Are you surprised? Are you surprised where you are?
Absolutely. I think, you know, what is really surprising about this is how surprising it is, yet also how familiar it seems, you know, that all the analysts that have spent so long looking at the Middle East are playing catch-up, you know. And I think your question earlier about why did it happen now, why did it take this long, I think a lot of Arabs are asking themselves this, and it's given them a sense, us and them, a sense of confidence about the future. And I think that's something that whatever happens next politically, that's something that no one can take away from them.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Thank you all very much. Well, while tonight the street violence and repression continues in Libya with the outcome for the Gaddafi regime unclear, what is clear is that the entire culture of the Middle East has changed. From Al Jazeera TV and access to the internet, Twitter and Facebook, this new generation is angry and not going to take it anymore. Paul Mason now assesses how the new media and new vigorous political culture have helped create and shape these new revolutions.
How do unarmed people defeat tanks, mercenaries, ruthless torturers? How do they succeed when Arab rulers have been given the tacit seal of approval by the leaders of democracies in the West? We're just weeks into the biggest upheaval the world has seen since 1989, and we don't know where it ends. But the social forces in these revolts are clear, as are the economic grievances.
We are tired. We are tired.
Mass unemployment and casual work are the reality for those who live in the slums and suburbs of North Africa. There's 24% youth unemployment, and this is a region where 2/3 were born after 1980.
Many of those in Tahrir were part of the urban poor community in Egypt, in places where urban poor slums existed. They played a heroic role in fighting the police who've been engaged in torture over there. I mean, police stations are largely regarded as torture centers here in Mubarak's Egypt. And the urban poor played a heroic role. Whenever the police showed up, they were among the foot soldiers of the revolution.
20 years of globalization have changed the demographics of North Africa. There is now a significant working class. There are unions, often as in Egypt, state-controlled. In Mahalla, 4 years ago, Egyptian workers launched a mass strike that should have been a warning to the regime.
If you look at the Mahalla events in 2008, for example, this was not necessarily a working class revolt. Actually, the strike, which has been called over in the Ghazl al-Mahalla textile mill, failed and did not happen because the police had occupied the textile mill. But who rebelled on that day and took part largely in the uprising? It was the urban poor in Mahalla, who at the end of the day are also related by blood ties to those workers in the factory. Remember, the issue of class here in Egypt, and I think I can generalize in the Arab world, class distinctions are not that concrete.
There was resentment among the poor, militancy among the workers. What it needed was a spark, and this came from another part of society. The sparks for these revolutions were networks of young and educated people. In Egypt, they'd mobilized for months on Facebook. Here, in a virtual online university, Egyptian bloggers get a lecture from a member of the Bush administration.
We really don't think it works very well to be preaching at people and telling them what to think.
Others used the social media to contact the anti-globalization left in Europe.
In the case of Twitter, for example, some of it's not so much reporting, but rather sort of people having a conversation and a dialogue. And what's interesting is when CNN and Al Jazeera and others start picking it up, that becomes part of the conversation. And so in a way, coming to protest or getting out to the street and mobilizing is something that completely flattens structures in terms of social hierarchy. You don't have the head of a trade union congress saying, we should all go to the streets. It's someone on Twitter saying, I'm now in Tahrir Square. His friends then see it. People start retweeting it. And so that you can see that what it does is essentially it sort of empowers people by giving them new tools and completely flattens sort of social hierarchies.
One thing the activists learned from the anti-globalization movement was the need for sophisticated techniques of resistance. Some studied the works of veteran non-violent expert Gene Sharp, who spoke to me on Skype.
When the masses of people lost their fear, and when people are no longer afraid that dictatorship is in big trouble, they maintained nonviolent discipline to a very remarkable degree, even when they had over 1 million people participating in a demonstration. These are important lessons for the future. Now people can see it was done there. Maybe we could do it also. In other words, the lesson of how to get rid of a dictatorship is like the genie is out of the bottle. People now understand broadly how to do it and have a chance of doing it again. But there are still problems, and they have to learn how to do it very skillfully.
The workers, the poor, the left, the intellectuals have so far proved a counterweight to the forces of tribalism and political Islam. So where does this leave the legion of Arabists and strategy consultants who failed to see it coming?
Because we live under the spectre and the shadow of the Islamic Revolution in 1979,